Okay, cool. So to open, let me present a quote from Senator Cory Booker of New Jersey, something that I heard when I was listening to MSNBC last Thursday. So it's quite an apt quote, actually. So it's namely, among other things, to turn your fear into fight and your worry into work. I thought this was very apt for the Advocacy 101 series. So, many of you mentioned last week that with recent events or current affairs, they have motivated you to take some form of action. And at least one of you have had extensive experience in doing so, more than me. And most of you are new to this, but have a lot of energy. And yeah, again, Senator Cory Booker's words are really apt here, and they apply really well. So the first formal thing I wanted to bring up is something called the GSC Policy Platform. And this GSC Policy Platform is a formal document that outlines and delineates our policy positions on various topics such as rights and diversity, quality of life, civic engagement and voting rights, higher education funding, international student issues, and just a lot more. So they do cover a lot of ground, but these are by no means complete. As you can kind of see from this recent passed by date is a work in progress, but it is a reference point that we kind of base our advocacy off. Now, even more formally, from the standpoint of the GSC, it formalizes our position, the GSC's positions, in fact. And let me kind of back up from this a little bit and just say that the GSC or the Graduate Student Council is the student governing body that ultimately is working to enhance the overall grad experience at MIT. We provide programming initiatives, activities, and we also liaise with MIT admin and faculty on your behalf, especially on things like increasing the student stipend. Now, under the overall umbrella of the GSC, there are committees touching on a variety of topics. So there's the executive committee, which is the general supervising body of the GSC. You also have the Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion, or DEI committee. There's a Housing and Community Affairs committee, Academics, Research and Careers committee, and there's more. Now, this workshop and what I'm focused on is presented by the External Affairs Board. And as the name suggests, it's the external arm of the GSC, the outward-facing entity of the GSC. So taking all of the above, the role of the policy platform is to tell the External Affairs Board or the EAB what the GSC definitely believes in, and and that the board can advocate for or share with the world the positions on behalf of the grad students at MIT. Now, to put what I said into some concrete terms, the policy platform or the positions that we advocate for is meant to be heard by, obviously MIT grad students, GSC contributors, and members and contributors of the EAB, the general public, government officials, and other partners and allies like student governments around the country, or other nonprofits or issue-focused organizations as well. Okay, so how do we decide what topics we run advocacy campaigns on or focus our energy on? And in fact, some of you already answered this question last week in your introductions. You came into these workshops already with interest in a wider array of issues, some focus, some general interest. Some of you talked about being interested in police reform, educational policy, healthcare, international student issues, criminal justice reform, environmental justice, including climate change, and more as well. So in that sense, these are the topics that we run with. And we, as the EAB as a whole, have as much capacity as our members have. Although nowadays we're doing a mix of putting out fires, like the July 6th ICE ruling for international students, the targeting of the optional practical training program, and also on some timely issues like research funding. Now, some of you may have heard about the latest announcement by the Department of Homeland Security for international students. It's not so much an announcement, more so it's a proposed change. And it's where international students here on student visas have traditionally been able to legally stay in the country over the duration that they are students in their institutions. and which the institution kind of affirms. And this new proposed rule would set a cap on this stay period with a maximum of 4 years, and even down to 2 years for students from certain countries, which is not ideal because most students at MIT are PhD students, and we stay here for more than 4 years usually. So we at the EAB are still processing this ourselves, but we're submitting a public comment in conjunction with other student governments around the country at some point. And in fact, we'll be meeting on Friday at 5 p.m. to talk about this. If you're not on the EAB mailing list and would like to come and or would like to be added to the mailing list, feel free to send me a message. I'll keep track of that, and I'll make sure to add you to it. Okay, anyhow, so in general, once you've identified the issue, there are a variety of avenues to channel that energy. So for one, there are rallies and protests, which have traditionally been very public expressions for or against various issues, and it's also protected under the First Amendment of the Constitution. So, of course, the commentary on that now and the broad landscape of these efforts have changed in quite the manner, especially over the last few months, but I won't elaborate on that. The next thing in the triangle or pyramid are visits to legislators' offices, which I'll talk about in detail next. And then you can also do phone calls and emails, as I was saying last week. You can also volunteer your time, expertise, and efforts under a non-partisan group like the EAB and the GSC, for example, or through MIT Votes on MIT as well, or through political campaigns. And there are also other non-profit organizations around the country that organize on varying levels, but are centered around a few key issues. So, for example, the Sunrise Movement is an American youth-led movement coordinated by Sunrise that advocates for political action on climate change. Another thing as well you could do is you could start your own group, though I don't have any experience in that, so I can't give any advice. And lastly, at the very top of the chain, you can also run for office. Although I regret to say, and I know there are a bunch of international students here, including myself, we don't have that option in the United States. You have that option in your home country, but ultimately, the rest of the options are kind of open to you. Now, that brings me to a point that I also kind of brought up at the start of the previous session. So the skills, lessons, methods that you see here and that I'm mentioning, they can be very well translated to your home countries for us international students. Although the caveat is that I'm not oblivious to the fact that different countries have very different political structures and norms, which may make some or maybe even all of what I've said moot points or irrelevant. But broadly, I'll point you back to Senator Cory Booker's words to turn your fear into fight and your worry into work. Whatever action that accompanies that, that varies. Now, coming back to the US, let's talk about the advocacy trips that the GSC and in particular the EAB takes on a regular basis, with the very huge caveat is that during non-pandemic times. Now, actually, let me stop there and see if there are any questions so far. Okay, so at the federal level, we have at least one trip a year where we send 4 people, typically 2 experienced people and 2 fresh faces to DC as part of the Legislative Action Days and Advocacy Summit with partner universities. And this is organized by the NAGPS, or the National Association of Graduate Professional Students. The program usually consists of 2 days of conference centered around policy and legislative topics, advocacy and panels, usually during the weekend. And then the next 2 days are the pre-arranged meetings with staffers on the Hill. And I think I'll have more detail on that soon. There's also the AAAS, Catalyzing Advocacy in Science and Engineering, or CASE, which is a lot more entry level, and it's basically just an introduction to the federal policy making process and advocacy. And there's a 1-day trip to the Hill for meetings as well at the end. So Jordan here has been to CASE before and can definitely tell you more on that if you're curious. We also have an additional DC trip if funding allows for kind of high impact or necessary trips. An example, I think, where neither Jordan, Benjamin, or I were here for that, is the emergency meeting in 2017, where when the grad student tuition tax waiver thing came up. I kind of talked about this briefly last week as well. And last year, we also took such a trip to talk about appropriations with committee staffers. Now, the last point on this federal level thing here. So, right now, thanks to the COVID-19 pandemic, we have been meeting with staffers more via phone calls and Zoom meetings at a kind of a 50-50 ratio. And, the calls vary in length. Benjamin can, say about this, but vary in like 5 minutes, 10, 15 minutes, usually-ish, from my understanding. We've already been doing some level of this before the pandemic, but that was mostly because we already established that relationship and connection through our visits to the Hill. Now, on the state level, there is a once a semester trip that we do to the Massachusetts legislature, and the idea is very similar as well. Now, again, the State House is so close to us. It's just across the river, I think 2 or 3 stops away on the Red Line. So, in principle, you can take as many trips as you need, and we've been back a couple of times for various hearings as well. Okay, so about the actual meetings themselves, the first step always is to set up those meetings. So choose relevant officers and the officers that you have a constituency claim for. So for the former, recall what I was saying last week about identifying key committee members or conference committee members on either the issue or the bill that you're focused on. And then for the latter with the constituency claim, there are various avenues that you can tap on. Either you are a student in the state of Massachusetts, which opens you up to the 9 congressional districts and the 2 senators, particularly Representative Ayanna Pressley and Representative Catherine Clark. Also, if your advocacy effort focuses on a particular bill, you should definitely keep track of its passage and where it is in the process. And another point about the constituency part is that, if you're from another state, if you've lived in another state, or if you've worked in that state before, or if your family is in or from another state, that's another claim as well. Now, and then once you have identified those people, you can go to the National Journal Almanac link I showed you all last week with the kind of details and committee assignments for those representatives and senators. You can go there and find the email addresses of the staffers or their schedulers, and then contact them about 2 weeks in advance and include brief notes on who you are, your constituency claim, topics you want to discuss, and then days and times you're available to kind of set that in stone. Now, one thing, one small little tidbit you might have noticed is that you send the emails about 2 weeks in advance, and you would think, and I thought that at first, that you want to be prepared or request much further in advance because the staffers and Congress persons are incredibly busy and filled up. Now, it turns out that they are incredibly busy and filled up, but the schedules are determined over pretty short timescales. And for virtual meetings and with Zoom technology, the timescale is really your availability and the staff's ability, given how easy relatively it is to set things up nowadays. Now, here's an example email from me based on a previous student's template. So I sent this to a staffers in Senator Elizabeth Warren's office. So, to reiterate the point I had before, first paragraph is who I was, what my constituency claim was. In this case, I'm a PhD student at MIT, so I'm currently based in Cambridge, Massachusetts. And one thing that may be good to preempt is how many students or people will be expected to join you in the meeting. So, in this case, there'll be a maximum of 4 graduate students in total from the EAB. So, it's not like I'm going along with President Raphael Reif or something like that. And then you also have a brief sentence summarizing the request for a meeting along with dates, and then they'll get back to you with times that they're available. Also, don't be shy about bolding important parts. And then in the last paragraph, I just very briefly listed the various issues that we planned on discussing, and note that these are the issues that are relevant and important to grad students at MIT, which is the core group that you're representing. Now, the order of some of these sentences can be rearranged however you like it, but again, the point is that you have the introduction, meeting request, and the discussion topics that you want. You definitely don't need to write a whole story to elaborate on anything. Leave that to the actual meeting itself. The point of the point of the email is to set up the meeting, so just keep it short and sweet. Now, a fourth point I'll make here is the email signature. So this is kind of like your virtual business card. And Congress can be pretty old-fashioned and formal in many senses. And so having a virtual business card, and by extension a physical business card when you meet in person, just makes you look a bit more fancy and formal. Now, the very last point I would emphasize and make, and kind of like a general life skill as well, you'll likely be sending these emails about 5 times, and it's really a matter of copy and pasting, I'll admit, but the danger behind copy and pasting is that you have to replace information, please. I tend to read emails about 20 times before I send them away, and so definitely in the process, make sure you're sending to the right staffers from the right office. Okay, so regarding meeting preparation, so I'm recycling the slides for a bit, so ignore the first part about professional attire. Though if you're having Zoom meetings, you should probably have some form of like formal attire for some old-fashioned professionalism. I'm probably gonna put in a little collared shirt next week's panel. The most important part is the second half of the slide, to research the office. So what position does the congressperson or the office have on the issue that you're interested in? You can do a quick Google for articles or interviews or debates. If you're looking at a particular bill, the first thing to check is to see if the congressperson is a co-sponsor or sponsor of the bill, which again are technical Congress speak for endorsements or introduction of a bill. Lastly, always remember that the Congress people, more so for the representatives than the senators in some sense, because the House, the representatives have 2-year tenures compared with senators, which have 6-year terms. These, they ultimately serve the constituents, they serve us, not the other way around. And therefore, it's important to always connect the issue to the constituents. For example, if you're talking about climate change, one handy but unfortunate fact is that from a study published by Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences in 2013, it's projected that the Boston Logan Airport, the very hub which we would take to go to DC, and no doubt Massachusetts representatives go to often, and a hub for many people in the state, that the airport will be underwater by 2100, and even more, like forward thinking, half of Cambridge could be below sea level by the early 2060s. So, kind of like these sort of little tidbits are kind of good to have as well in the meetings. Now, when it comes to the meetings themselves, whether it's in person or on Zoom, definitely be on time. This other point about security and all, you definitely don't have to worry about now. And if you come with us on a trip to DC in the future, these points will be reiterated to you. I'm kind of just mentioning it here as for like for tidbits and little things and for completeness sake. Now, the second point here about flexibility is that sometimes you just have to play it by ear. I've had a meeting or two in the hallways of Congress because there wasn't any room anywhere in the office, not necessarily because they're trying to get rid of you as quickly as possible. I've also had meetings where not everyone who emailed turns up. Yeah, Benjamin is saying he had an email in the closet before. That's all fine. Things pop up. Sometimes your meetings are scheduled for 30 minutes and they can only give you 10 minutes of your time because an emergency hearing just came up, which also happened to me as well. For the 3 other points though, they're kind of standard and they apply to virtual and in-person meetings. Be polite, professional, be honest. Don't BS your way through anything, and offer to follow up at the end of the meeting. Let me stop there and see if there are any other questions. Cool. Okay, so in the meeting itself, there are times where, again, you have to play it by ear. And as I was saying before, not every meeting is in some conference room where you get the luxury of sitting down and taking notes. Okay, now, so one thing I don't think I've explicitly mentioned yet. I mean, I kind of have. So, there's 4 people on the trip usually, 2 experienced people, 2 new people. Really, the purpose of that is just to kind of maintain that pipeline and train new people to do work like this. And sometimes you have the 4 of you together in the meetings, and you either have 3 people talking and 1 person taking notes, or 2 and 2. It really depends on the topics that the 4 of you are comfortable talking about, or if 1 person has already had some previous existing relation with the staffer that you're talking to. There's also some social dynamics that come into play here, and at a point you kind of just have to like judge it and play it by ear. Of course, it's not completely ad hoc either. Ideally, the 4 of you would have talked about this the day before, the morning of, or on your way to the meetings themselves. Now, okay, so with that the digression out of the way, what happens when you walk inside? Metaphorically speaking, so Zoom is different. So what happens when you sit down with the staff for your meeting, or again, or it's virtual. So obviously, first thing, introduce yourself. They'll be roughly aware of the person who contacted them for the meeting, but they certainly won't remember all the details. They roughly know that the 4 of you are MIT grad students advocating on behalf of the roughly 7,000 MIT grad students. So that's the introduction and the context that you're giving. For the bulk of the meeting, you're usually talking on 3 or 4 topics. And then, first of all, it would be nice to start off each topic recognizing the congressperson's recent efforts, especially if they did things like speaking publicly about an issue or bill, if they recently co-sponsored or sponsored a bill, and the kind of the broad issue that you're interested in. They definitely, certainly would appreciate that compliment. Now, and the topic or the meeting is starting off on a good note, and it also, like, more importantly, it shows that you've done your homework. Okay, so after you praise them and compliment them for their work, you got to go down to business. You're laying down the context, things like the background, the issue. Get seeing things, for example, like immigration is an important part of your advocacy because about 40% of the MIT grad student population are international students, and they bring a diversity of ideas and contribute immensely to the research landscape. So things like that. And then the main asks that you have there in the meeting, and this was actually one of the asks on my trip to DC, was to have these congressional officers keep track of or get in touch with the State Department to inquire about their stance on domestic renewal of visas for international students. And actually, I'm not sure where that kind of effort been to. Benjamin will probably comment right now. But anyways, the story, in fact, is that one hurdle the international students face is not having to go back to their home countries in order to renew their student visas. In some cases, the waiting period can be uncertain, and this was already the case in non-COVID times, and this prevents students from planning their return in some reliable manner. So opportunities like teaching, mentoring undergrad students, seeking internships are cut off to these students because they'll be in limbo, and not to mention the rent, the accrued rent as a result of their absence here. So Chinese students, for example, which we have, I think, about 700 out of 7,000 at MIT, they're given visas lasting only a year, and this unfairly burdens them. So therefore, we were there to push on getting an answer about the domestic renewal of visas and kind of see where that stood. So this is kind of like the story, the ask that we lay out to them in a meeting. So once you've done all of that, so the point in blue, the staffers may ask a question or two, or you may have thought of something during the process, but otherwise you can just summarize, repeat your ask, and the staffers will probably say something if they haven't about what they know about the process. Then you also do this for the other topics. Usually you have about 30 minutes allocated, and it really depends on the nature of the meeting. Sometimes you get a really nice discussion with them, or they may just listen to you, nod, and that's about it. the important thing, of course, is definitely remain courteous. Say what you need to say, and leave it at that. Now, you see at the bottom, there's something called about a handout. And so what we've usually done in the past is to give them a handout, something called a leave behind. It's something that you leave behind. And it's a simple one-pager that summarizes the 4 topics that you have talked about with the staffer. Now, Benjamin can tell you more about these, but the word is that there are at least some staffers. There's a caveat that there are small number of statistics attached to these words who don't even look at this. And there are probably better ways to have a bigger impact. And this is actually part of my job as development chair here at the EAB, although I'm kind of leaving that to the next semester to think about. But the point, which I will kind of reiterate again in the next few minutes, is to follow up. Now, anyway, so after the meeting, once you're back home, send a follow-up email thanking them for the time in the meeting, reiterate your asks, answer any questions that may have come up in the chat with them, and then attach any relevant documents or resources. Now, going to my main point, let me stop there and see if there are any questions about what I've said about the meeting structure and all. You're also welcome to send me questions privately through the chat.
I guess I have a brief comment on the leave behind. So yeah, we've heard, I just directly asked some staffers about this because I'd heard rumor that a lot of them don't really like them. And at least the 100% of the sample size of like 5 or 6 that I asked all said that they immediately go in the trash as soon as they get it before they even get back to their desk. But they said if you send PDFs, they're like more likely to keep it if it's like in an email, but they're not going to scan it. They're not going to like file it away. They don't do that anymore. So like, these are just kind of if it's important, they'll write it down in the meeting. So you just have to make sure you get the important points across in the actual meeting and don't just rely on the handout as a crutch.
Yeah, and not printing also kind of saves paper, so why not? Okay. So anyways, what I mentioned above are all trips, physical trips where you meet the staffers in person, and of course these are very important because you're establishing a relation with these staffers, and if you continue doing this, you're continuing to build upon that relationship and get yourself heard. Now, what's important is what comes after. I've not been great at this personally, but Benjamin and some others have been very proactive about this, and that's continuing to talk to these staffers by phone or Zooms throughout the year. And I mentioned before that there are various issues that we're working on right now, so including research security, immigration, COVID relief, research funding, and more. And they come up from time to time and now, and it's important to have that we have a consistent channel in which grad student voices are being heard at the table. So last week in the workshop, I was talking about the Grad Student Savings Act of 2019 and how we sent a note of thanks to Representative Joe Kennedy of Massachusetts when we found out that he was driving for this to be included in an appropriations bill. And this is one way of maintaining relationships because they get negative press stands out more than positive ones. And the officers do really appreciate it when constituents pay attention to the work that they're doing, and they do respect it coming from us students. And this again gives you a way to build on that relationship. The last point I'll make is that legislative staffers are humans too. They have a history, a family, friends, and more, and they also deserve respect. Okay, so the change tracks a little. I want to talk about statements or endorsements. And I think Benjamin may or may not pipe in about this. But the purpose of us writing statements, and I'll give an example soon, is to formalize our positions on specific bills or issues that come up from time to time in some public manner. So here are some examples on the various statements we have done on the federal level. So hold on, sorry, I'm just keeping track of my slides. Okay, so on the federal level, we've done endorsements or statements on various bills, so like the graduate student retirement savings I was talking about, also like the Chinese visa policy and the endless Endless Frontier Act, and more. So there's quite a lot of them. And if you want to see the full list, you can go onto the GSC website for these. Now, the most recent statement we have, or more technically it's an endorsement, is on the topic of supporting early career researchers in the COVID-19 pandemic. And hopefully you can see it. It's a bit squeezed, but we kind of start out by outlining the number of students we are representing, what our general positions are in terms of strengthening the STEM pipelines in this case, what we are endorsing, which in this case was the Supporting Early Career Researchers Act. And then, you have a generic outline of what's at stake, the background, the key context, and then you're also in this third paragraph recognizing or endorsing the efforts made by the various Congress people in bringing this bill up, and then ending off with contact details. So what's the point in all of this, right? So again, along the lines of what we were just talking about, is about paying attention and staying engaged in the process, and also letting the public, the grad students, and people on the Hill know that we are doing that. And in fact, we've had some of our endorsements placed alongside other organizations for certain bills as well. So, the visibility is important. I'll also briefly add, you may have noticed this somewhere at the bottom, is that the EAB, particularly Benjamin, has been working a lot with Divyansh Kaushik from the Carnegie Mellon University, and he can tell you more about that. But having this coalition helps to bring in more students into the calculus, and that makes our efforts that much more visible and effective. Now, this is directly related to what we were just saying about the statements of endorsements, but also, relevant to advocacy in general. You have all of these issues that you're interested in. So, reading the news, getting the pulse from social media in a productive way, emphasizing that point. Newsletters, if you subscribe to them, keeping track of bills, reports from Congress or other think tanks, and what other organizations are saying about certain bills or issues. All of these are a good thing to have in your constant media diet. In regards to these statements and endorsements themselves, you should think about your position first. Are you for or against an issue? Do you support or not support a bill? And when if you're writing to Congress people, decide what your ask is first. Most of us here have written technical or scientific reports in the form of papers or articles, and we have this tendency to throw in a lot of background statistics and latch onto having some form of long and coherent message. Now, here is different. Remember the example in the previous slide. That is pretty short by our standards for people engaging in research. And then here's a slide just summarizing the resources or newsletters, some of which I've shown last week as well. Okay, so again, to reiterate, clearly articulate what you want, why you want it. My advice is don't be long-winded, but don't be vague. So to be succinct. And these bullet points are what I was saying before in conjunction with that example statement. Introduce yourself, clearly lay down your ask, provide key and relevant facts, and be accurate, be concise, and also be specific. Okay, any questions? Cool. Okay, so as I was saying at the start, there's a nice little activity that I've kind of called the meeting simulation, which is kind of based loosely on the meetings I've had on the Hill. So what we're going to do is we'll break you up into 2 breakout rooms. I'll keep an eye on one of them, and Benjamin will keep an eye on the other. And what's going to happen is that you all will be doing some mock meeting around the topic of climate change, again, based loosely on meetings I've had on the Hill. Now, there are 2 scripts, and there's a reason for that, and that's part of how I designed this activity. And in each script, there's a thing for a grad student to talk, and there's another thing for the staffer. And so at least 4 people will be talking in some form, because it'd be nice to have 2 different pairs speak. And the rest of you should just listen, think about what's going on there, see what differences are between the two scripts that I'm going to attach down in the chat real soon. Again, script A, I may have shared this with some of you, script A was actually from an office that is already pro climate change, as you probably have found out from the very first minute. Whereas script B was from an office that is roughly appreciative of the fact of human-caused climate change. Both of us were the same, but it's not necessarily worried about it per se. That's where you were throwing in facts like Tennessee had a strong tornado season in 2011, which caused billions of dollars in damage, and many people in small businesses suffered as a result. And then, as a consequence of climate change, this will continue, increase in frequency and strength, and unless something is done. For the other office, you're on the same page about needing to take action. And in fact, you're talking to an office with a proven leadership on this issue. So you could have actually taken some time to ask about their technical views and opinions on the statuses of issues or bills, or you can just spend more time on the other topics that you want to talk about. To emphasize, you had a script with just one topic. And, of course, in an actual meeting, you'll probably be speaking about a few other issues as well. Now, one thing that you may have noticed is that I've almost never said the words Democrats or Republicans today. Everything I've talked about in the last two sessions, completely applicable to either party when you're setting up meetings with them. But having said that, I'm not impervious to the fact that polarization is at an all-time high. There's a lot of politics that goes into the decisions that Congress people make. Climate change, taxes, police reform, immigration. They have to make these calculations, just to name a few of these issues. And we do factor this into our advocacy strategy as well, about who to contact and how to say what we want to say. Now, let me talk about two more brief things. So this is not an advocacy channel, which isn't necessarily as involved as doing a super deep dive into an issue and getting in direct contact and or maintaining that with a staffer. So the first thing I mentioned last week is a phone call where you simply, clearly and simply state the topic that you care about and your position on that issue. Give a brief story maybe. The office will note your call. And if you can get your friends and family to do the same, this will definitely pique the interest of the office and the congressperson as an issue that their constituents have near the top of their minds. If you're a bit more socially anxious like myself, letters and emails, they work as well. But you shouldn't use some generic standard letter format. Customize them, personalize them. Make sure there's a name and address attached to it. Be polite and clear, emphatic, persuasive. Make clear what your asks are and repeat them. Mention them at the start and repeat them at the end. Okay, so we've come to the end of the workshop. So before I end off, does anyone have any questions, or if Benjamin has anything he wants to add? Okay, let me open up the chat because I had that removed. Okay. So yeah, I want to add up with three things. So first, as a short point, I do need to edit the slides a bit before I share them, but I will do so eventually, probably this weekend, because I no longer have to spend time preparing for this. Now, the second point, which is a longer point, I've bombarded you with a whole bunch of information over the last 2 weeks. I suspect that there's a varying level of reaction to this. I don't expect all of what I said to have made sense, which is fine. So, if you have questions about the slides or what I've said, you're more than welcome to email me, get in contact with Benjamin, or just come along to any of our EAB meetings and continue taking in things. But the main point I wanted to make, or I might anticipate, is that some of you may be intimidated by how involved it can be. Benjamin and I came into the EAB, and for me, into the country, knowing absolutely nothing about all of this. We were broadly paying attention to the show that is politics, but practically speaking, we were just learning as we go. There are always things to do, bills to pay attention to, staffers that you can talk to, advocacy strategies to refine. But the thing you should not forget is that there are people in organizations and in Congress who for them, this is their entire job. You know, and I've not mentioned this really yet, but you know, MIT has an entire office in DC whose job is solely to correspond with people in Congress and to manage the relations between Congress and MIT. So, you know, you're at MIT first and foremost as grad students engaged in, you know, either your research or your coursework, you know, and you know, with advocacy, you can and should take on as much as you can at the time. You know, I know it's tempting to always want to jump onto every issue. I trust me, I get that. But the reality is that, you know, our bandwidth is limited, and you know, we all understand it, of course. And you know, but what's not okay, in my opinion, is flaking. You know, you should set priorities, boundaries where you can. You know, make sure you're taking care of yourself first and foremost. Now, but I'm also not oblivious to the fact that this is a very unusual year with a very unusual administration and a very unusual deviation from the usual system of checks and balances. And you know, many of you have identified that, and you have derived energy to do something as a result, which is great. And the purpose of what I'm saying is, you know, genuinely not trying to drive you away. I'm a realist. I like to give realistic, nuanced take and or lens and all of this. And I guess taking this as like a personal privilege as host to say this. You know, there's no binary option, no zero-sum game to be played here, and hopefully I kind of make that point. Now, thirdly, lastly, my final point, and this is the last slide. Next week, we'll be hearing from Cambridge Mayor Sumul Siddiqui, Deputy Legislative Director Josh Delaney from the Office of Senator Elizabeth Warren, and State Representative Jay Livingstone on various topics. So, you know, this bookshop will really complete the series because, you know, last week you heard about the legislative structure, how bills are passed, which are important because you need to know the pipeline that you're dealing with. Today, with the understanding of that pipeline, we looked at how to tackle that pipeline, where to insert ourselves in the process, and what to do once we're talking with these key people. And then next week, you'll be hearing directly from these key players about, you know, the perspectives, you know, what's happening on the ground. And yeah, so as you see on the top, this will be in the form of a Zoom webinar. You know, this is a different link to the two workshops and also a different format. And I'll send out reminder emails about this as well. And with that, I think that's the end of today's workshop. So let me stop the recording and see if there are any questions or lingering thoughts there.